everybody. A couple of days ago, we did a show with the American journalist Kenneth Rosen about what he calls the melting ice and vanishing cultures of the Arctic region. He has a new book out. It's called Polar War. And it speaks of the way in which we seem to be returning to a 19th century kind of colonialism where the great powers, Trump and the Russians and the Chinese, are sweeping the slate clean, rebuilding their own vision of the future on top of indigenous peoples and cultures and environments. Seems to be a very troubling and perhaps tragic theme of the first quarter of the 21st century. And it's certainly manifested in Gaza, where Donald Trump in particular replaced the history, the real people, the real vibrancy of the region, of the Strip, with his own Las Vegas glitzy version of a Trump Gaza. Of course, the truth of Gaza, the real truth, is of a bombed out, flattened zone. So I thought today it might be interesting to talk about the real Gaza with the co-author of an important new book. It's called Gaza, The Dream and the Nightmare, and Maia Hallward, who is an expert in peace resolution, who teaches at Kennesaw State University just outside Atlanta, is joining us. Maia, congratulations on the new book. In my introduction, I mean, obviously Gaza is very different from the Arctic, but is that a theme, a return to a kind of extreme form of colonialism on the Gaza Strip? Of course, that part of the world has been the stage for various chapters of Western colonialism over the last few centuries. But is that one way to begin to think about what's happened in Gaza over the last few years, or indeed the last few decades?
I mean, I think colonialism is definitely, and foreign control is definitely one lens to think about Gaza. In the first chapters of the book that you mentioned, my co-author Julie Norman and I really lay out the fact that Gaza has a very long history, and the idea of the Gaza Strip as the Gaza Strip itself is a relatively recent geographical configuration in the context of Gaza, which was at the crossroads of civilizations linking northern and southern empires, eastern and western empires, right at the crux of where Africa and Asia and Europe sort of come together on sort of the edge of the Mediterranean. And so, yes, Gaza does have that these last century or so of colonial influence and external influence, but it also has a very long history of being a vibrant center of crossings of empire that it's important to keep in mind as well.
So where would we begin, or where do you begin in your history of Gaza, Maia?
Yeah, so in the book, we do talk a little bit about this a longer trajectory of Gaza, but we really sort of look at the fact that Gaza in its current configuration, really, we think about starting in 1948, really, with Israel's War of Independence and the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, where there were Palestinians who were living in what's now the Gaza Strip prior to that. But before that, it was a region under the British, and prior to that, it was part of sort of the district of Jerusalem under the Ottomans. And this current stretch piece of the Gaza Strip didn't really come into its current shape as the Gaza Strip until really the 1948 to 1967. It was under Egyptian administration, and then it was under Israeli administration. The original section of Gaza was larger at first. It was sort of part of that partition plan that the United Nations put forth that never really came to fruition, UN Resolution 181. And so when the War of Independence, or the Nakba, happened, many Palestinians from different parts of what was then the Mandate of Palestine ended up coming to what's now the Gaza Strip, thinking they were just going to be there for a short period of time. That area was also part of the Arab designated part of the partition plan. But then many of them ended up staying because there was no way to then go back to where their homes were. And so what became the Gaza Strip was inflated population-wise by all of these refugees from 1948 who added to what had been the local population. And so
So
many of
Maya, were there religious, ideological, political, economic divisions always between the, shall we call them, the indigenous people of the Gaza area and then the refugees who came in after 1948?
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say religious or ideological per se, but there were some economic and social differences at first. With some of them, particularly a lot of the refugees were living in sort of concentrated camps. They were seen as a little bit of outsiders, but over time, those changes have those refugees became part of the fabric. Now, there are many refugees who still live in sort of the camps because there's not a lot of space in Gaza to expand. But many of those who we interviewed spoke about how at first there were some differences between those who had been based in Gaza and those who became refugees, but that over time those differences became less meaningful.
And then how did the wars, the subsequent wars after 1948, how did they impact on Gaza, the war of 67 and 73?
Yeah, so in 1967, and there was also in 1956, there was a brief Israeli occupation during the Suez Crisis as well. Sort of
And of course, it's worth
yeah.
reminding everybody, and not everyone's going to be as familiar as Maia with this, is that the Gaza, what we now call the Gaza Strip, although she notes it's not really the Gaza Strip, is very close to Egypt. So it had strategic significance in terms of the Suez Crisis of 1956.
Yeah, exactly. And Egypt was the administrative power over the Gaza Strip from 1948 until 1967, except for that 1956 sort of part of the Suez Crisis. But so in 1967, Israel became in control of the Gaza Strip and operated it and administrated it and had a military presence there. And then eventually there were settlements that were put in place, settlers that came into the Gaza Strip. And those settlements and the checkpoints that were associated with the military presence really divided the northern Gaza Strip from the southern Gaza Strip. And we really heard from several of those we interviewed for this project about how they didn't even know their relatives that lived in the southern part of the Gaza Strip because of how difficult it was to travel across these checkpoints and to get to the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And some of those we interviewed talked about how their family wouldn't consider a marriage with somebody who was from either the south or the north, depending on where they were, because of how difficult it would be to visit, etc. So even though the Gaza Strip is a very small,
yeah, I mean, it's the smallness
space,
of it. I mean, it's worth noting. I mean, perhaps
yeah.
You might remind us of its size.
So the exact dimensions are now, of course, going to fly out of my head. But it is a very small region, and you have over 2 million people living in it. I would have to that the size is several large cities crammed together, but it's very small space.
Yeah, I mean, especially for
altogether.
an American audience, you in Georgia, me in California, it's unimaginably small. Let's go back to 67, Maya, and the Israeli. What did the Israelis invade Gaza and then occupy it? How did it work out? And what were the immediate consequences of I guess, would it be fair to say the replacement of the Egyptians by the Israelis, or is that the wrong way of thinking of it?
Yeah, so you had a shift in administration in the Gaza Strip from Egyptian to Israeli control. Just as in the West Bank, you had a shift from Jordanian control to Israeli control. So you then had Israel was responsible for all of the security, for all of the infrastructure, for all of the civil administration. And so Israel controlled the life of Palestinians in that way. What did happen in 1967, though, as well, was then you did have a shift in some of the opening of jobs for many Palestinians in Gaza ended up working in Israel and in the Israeli economy. And some of those we interviewed even talked about how, ironically, they ended up working as an agricultural laborer on farms very near where their families had originally come from, and how that was both a special thing, but also a very difficult reality to be that close to where their families' lands were, but not be able to access them and to know that they were there working for 60 cents a day. And so after 1967, you did have more Palestinians working in the Israeli economy for very low wages, but also Israel controlled sort of the lives of Palestinians, and you had sort of military installations in Gaza. And as I said, also you had the building again of these settlements in Gaza, which then led to restrictions of movement for Palestinians within the Gaza Strip.
Let's go back briefly, Maia, to the Egyptian administration of Gaza. How ambivalent were the Egyptians, particularly after 56, with Palestinian politics, Palestinian independence movements? Were there groups in Gaza, for example, that they might like or dislike more than others? We have the beginnings, of course, of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO. We don't have any inkling, really, back then, I guess, of Hamas. But what were the politics of the Egyptian administrators or occupiers, depending how you want to define it, in terms of the Palestinian people?
Yeah, so we don't talk extensively about the Egyptian period in the book. We really talk more starting after later in our focus. But a couple key points to mention in terms of the relationship of Egypt and the Gaza Strip. One is that the Muslim Brotherhood, which had its origins in Egypt, is the roots for Hamas, right? So Hamas was the Gazan branch of the Muslim Brotherhood and stayed relatively as a social, civil organization, humanitarian organization, and outside of politics until the late 1980s, when Hamas became an entity that became very politically oriented and was very involved in the first Intifada. But up until then had been more sort of a social community, grassroots organization, very embedded in the community, and that has its connections to Egypt. The other thing I think is worth mentioning in the context of this book is that Egypt worked with, as you mentioned, Egypt borders is the Gaza Strip and Israel there. One of the key entry and exit points of the Gaza Strip is the Rafah crossing into Egypt, and Egypt has maintained control of this crossing, as well as Israel controlling the Eretz crossing and other entries and exit points from Gaza. And Egypt has cooperated with Israel on the siege and the blockade in Gaza since the early 2000s. So Egypt is a continuing actor that's very invested in what goes on in Gaza and the entry and exit of people into Gaza. And several of those we interviewed also talked about how one of the times of the most openness for Gaza in terms of Gazans being able to enter and leave was during Mohamed Morsi's brief reign of power after the Arab uprisings in Egypt. So that's more contemporary than that earlier Egyptian administration you reference. But I think it is a good point to mention that Egypt does definitely have a role in this and was very involved in some of the reconciliation talks between Hamas and the PLO and Palestinian Authority. And so Egypt is definitely still a player in what happens in Gaza.
And of course, we had the Egyptian peace, the Sadat peace with with Israel, which I'm guessing had a huge impact on Gaza. You mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood. Was there always rivalry or perhaps antipathy in Gaza between the Brotherhood, who, as you note, were the sort of the early intellectual, ideological, organizational antecedents of Hamas, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, a much more secular organization, which indeed was made up both of Muslims and Christians?
So I think at first, once Hamas became a political entity, then there definitely was rivalry between Fatah and the PLO and Hamas, because Hamas is not part of the PLO, and Hamas was in part encouraged to be as a rival to Fatah. But as
when you say encouraged, I mean they didn't agree very much about the world, for better or worse. I mean,
no, they don't at all. But there are many who do talk about Hamas being encouraged by outside powers and developed and allowed to develop in ways, in part as an alternative party to Fatah, which was seen as a threat to Israel and other external actors in mobilizing for national resistance.
And there is the narrative that Israel is one of those powers. Is that what you argue in your book, that Israel originally was a kind of sponsor or turned a blind eye to Hamas in Gaza?
We don't make an argument about that in the book, but there are many who do make that claim, and I do think what's important about Hamas in its brotherhood phase is that Hamas has multiple wings, right? So it has its humanitarian wing that involves in charity, in education, in community support, because under the Israeli administration, there were many services. I mean, there's no Palestinian state. To this day, there's Palestinian statehood recognized by many states around the world, but there's no functioning autonomous state with sovereignty, either in Gaza or in the West Bank. And so many civil society organizations and community organizations mobilized throughout Palestinian history to meet the needs of the community. And Hamas was one of those. Before Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, and now some of Hamas's efforts are aimed at charitable work within the community. And so there are many people who came to Hamas from the support they received through community services, through education, etc. And so I think that is one of the major roles that the Muslim Brotherhood played, as well as sort of trying to have society live by certain Islamic values prior to it becoming political. And even still, there's the community wings of Hamas, as well as the militant wings and the political factors.
So how do you deal with that? I know you're in the Peace Studies department at your university. You're clearly sympathetic to the plight of the tragedy of the Gazan people. How do you deal with an organization like Hamas, which, as you say, has this quote unquote peace wing, and yet also clearly is highly militarized and enormously controversial?
Right. Well, I didn't say they have a peace wing. They have sort of a community, sort of humanitarian wing and a political wing and a militant wing. I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind about Hamas is that Hamas has several key factors going for it, right? It has the religious aspect, the resistance aspect, and the nationalist aspect. And this religious aspect and the political resistance aspect feed onto each other, because once Hamas was in control, you sort of had them have the political control, and then they also had the message in the mosque that reinforced each other. It is important to keep in mind, though, that a lot of Hamas has gained a lot of the power it had through some of the sort of the siege put on them, the international blockade put on them, the inability of Gazans to have any alternative given the blockade that has been put on Gaza, the inability of Gazans to go in and out. And that control has in many ways reinforced the power of Hamas. And many of the Gazans we interviewed talked about how they didn't necessarily support Hamas, but they were left without any alternatives. And that some of them even said they thought Hamas wouldn't have lasted as long as they have had there not been so much international pressure put on them, so much blockade put on them, such that Hamas controlled all of the channels that remained in terms of going in and out of Gaza through the tunnels. So I think in order to sort of create a political future for Palestinians, I think in some kind of engagement with Hamas, and particularly with their political actors, is important. And many of the approaches that international actors have taken to date has been exclusionary of Hamas, and sort of note the sort of four no's, etc. And I think it's really important to pay attention to what various factions in Palestine are saying, and to make sure that Palestinians themselves, the ordinary people of Palestine in Gaza, have a say in their future and have a say in their political choices going forward, without the international community banning entire segments.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about the international community, we're really talking about the United States. Maia, what was the relationship post 67 between Gaza and the West Bank, as they all were occupied by Israel, and they all began to think or rethink the idea of Palestinian independence. Was there a rivalry between Gaza and the West Bank? There was the West Bank, if not looked down on Gaza, saw it as a younger brother, or because of, as you note, because of the nature of the Israeli occupation, which often made it very hard for people to communicate, as in Gaza, North and South Gaza. Was there actually, in practice, not a great deal of communication between the Palestinians in Gaza and the Palestinians on the West Bank?
That's a really great question. As you noted, there has been a lot of effort over time to fragment Palestinian communities from each other. And so there's this fragmentation between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, between those Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, between those who live in Jerusalem, those of the diaspora. So there are, and in the West Bank now, there's sort of areas A, B, and C, and there's difficulty getting between them. Some of those who we interviewed did talk about how even going from Gaza into going to universities or academic programs in the West Bank was prohibited by Israel. And so it has been very difficult for Palestinians between Gaza and the West Bank to visit each other, to take classes in each other's universities. There was I think between 1967 and the First Intifada, there was a degree of more openness in that it was all under Israeli control. And I've heard Palestinians talk about how at that point it was easier to travel from the West Bank into 1948 Israel and between Gaza and 1948 Israel, largely as laborers, but often had to go back to their home communities at night. After the First Intifada and during the Oslo period, it became much more difficult to travel. The checkpoints became more, the separate settler roads became more. There was a brief window during Oslo when people thought there was hope and things were going to be better. And then the people we interviewed talked about how they had hope, they gave it a chance, and then it quickly showed that it was actually made many things worse. I mentioned earlier that I did visit Gaza twice in the late 1990s when there was a brief opening of what was called the Safe Passage Road between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so for a very brief window, there was this possibility to travel between the two, but it was a very short window that was open. And generally speaking, it's been challenging particularly from people from Gaza to exit Gaza and to enter the West Bank, even for academic purposes.
And what about official relations between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas? What kind of relations existed? Were they the Palestinian Authority, who pretty much controlled the West Bank, and Hamas in Gaza? Were they close? Were they rivals? Did they compete for sort of leadership of resisting Israel?
That's a good question. So Hamas really did has put it forth itself as a resistance organization, a national resistance. And that is when it came out in the First Intifada. It then was resisting to the Oslo Accords. And the Palestinian Authority was tasked by Israel with really reining in Hamas as part of its job as the administrator in the West Bank. One of the things we talk about in the book is that when Hamas ran for election in 2005, 2006, this was a big shift for the Hamas, which previously had not run in national elections. It had really focused on local issues and municipal elections, and saw running in broader elections as buying into the Oslo framework, which it had rejected. And so then you have this split when Hamas unexpectedly won the elections in 2006 and the international community boycotted that. Then you have this rupture between Hamas and Fatah, this very serious rupture that led to two separate governments, one in Gaza and one in the West Bank. And this is seen by many as a huge challenge for Palestinians moving forward, for Palestinian self-rule, because you have these two rival governments and it's unclear who speaks for Gaza. And so there have been multiple efforts to try to bring reconciliation agreements between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And that has been an ongoing challenge and will remain an ongoing challenge going forward, this rupture that occurred after 2006.
Maia, are there Palestinian politicians, activists, Barghouti comes to mind, who are able to breach this rupture? People who can talk to both, I don't know whether you want to call it wings or groups, the Islamists and the secularists, or the nationalists within the Palestinian community?
I think one of the most powerful messages that came out shortly after this election and this rupture was from the prisoners, and a lot of the most Palestinian leaders that have the most sort of wide range support are in prison. A lot of
like Barghouti, of course,
like Barghouti and others. There are thousands of Palestinian prisoners, and many who are in administrative detention without charges as well. And the prisoners' document came out across borders trying to call for reconciliation and unity. There were also a lot of youth movements that called for reconciliation during those years. And then Egypt and the Carter Center and many other organizations have worked to try to build reconciliation between the parties over the years too. And there have been times when they've been very close or they've reached agreement, but then having it sort of implemented and lasting has been more challenging. But you also haven't had elections, Palestinian elections, since 2006.
Maia, obviously the images now of Gaza are mostly of just dramatic destruction, rather like Berlin after the Second World War. In your book, what was life like in Gaza between 1967 and the period before October 7th?
So
I know that it's a generalized question, right. But some of the stuff I've heard is if not ideal, certainly an attractive notion of, Gaza was cut off from the rest of the world, but it had sort of a vibrant cultural scene, an economy that worked, a people that lived in relative harmony. What generalizations do you and Julie Norman make in your book on Gaza about this period?
Yeah, so that's a great point, that we don't hear about the positive nature of Gaza. And that's the title of the book. The Dream and the Nightmare actually came from one of the interviews we conducted for the book, where one of the Gazans spoke about how Gaza was like a dream and a nightmare at the same time, and how there was so much social solidarity and very strong community support mechanisms, and how the community looked out for each other, and how life was simple in a positive way, and how there was so much celebration and love of life. How there were community organizations, there were film buses on wheels, there were a lot of civil society organizations, there were dance troupes, there were different organizations, human rights organizations, community centers, women's groups, and those we interviewed talked about all of these different roles that they carried on as students, as teachers, as civil society actors, as lawyers, who worked in their communities. And several of them talked about how they had opportunities to leave, to work elsewhere in the world, but they rejected them because they loved Gaza and they wanted to remain with their people and with their families. And while it was a simple life and not always there were electricity cuts and there were a lot of challenges in Gaza and restrictions on movement and goods in and out, particularly after 2005, that it was still a place that they loved and their home, and they mourned it and missed it when they left to go study abroad or to get education in another place.
What about the role of Hamas? I mean, not everyone, I think, will share that idyllic notion. Certainly in Israel, but elsewhere, you'll have arguments suggesting that Hamas ruled Gaza with an iron fist, and it's all very well if you were part of Hamas, you didn't challenge them, but if you questioned Hamas's leadership, if you wanted to represent a non-Islamic position on Palestine, then you were silenced. Do you write about that in the book? I mean, one can't argue, can one, Maia, that Gaza was a democracy in this period.
Oh yeah, so we do talk about Hamas's rule and some of the challenges of Hamas's rule, but I do want to you sort of talked about from 1967 to today, and Hamas didn't even exist until
Right.
1982.
Good point.
So between 1967 and 1987, that first 20 years, there was no Hamas. And so under that period of time, it was under Israeli rule and then under Israeli administration, right? And then so in 1988, you have Hamas, but you're still under Israeli rule, the first Intifada. And it's not until 2006 that Hamas wins the legislative elections that were held across.
Right. And just to remind everyone, and I apologize for glossing over this. So when did Gaza acquire a sort of a degree of autonomy from Israel?
So that's a very good question. So Israel occupied Gaza after the 1967 Six-Day War. And so from 1967 until the First Intifada, Israel was in control of Gaza, and then through the First Intifada. After the First Intifada, you had the Oslo process, and the Oslo Accords first gave some autonomy to Gaza and Jericho first in 1994. So you had some degree of Palestinian autonomy, still under Israeli rule, but a sort of a devolved self-government in Gaza starting in 1994-ish, and in Jericho. And then you had the Palestinian Authority began to develop its institutions during the Oslo period, which went roughly 1993 till people talk about sort of the early 2000s. You had the death of Yasser Arafat in 2003, 2004, and then you had the Israeli disengagement from Gaza in 2005. Now, Israel withdrew its soldiers and the settlements from the Gaza Strip in 2005. This was a very controversial process, both inside Israel and within Palestine as well. At that time, this is where this debate happens that Israel considers itself no longer occupying the Gaza Strip up until 2023. But according to international law and many international organizations, and as many Israeli civil society organizations as well, Israel maintains effective control over Gaza because it controls the borders, it controls the airspace, it controls the water space, it controls what goes in and out of Gaza. It maintains a blockade on Gaza since then. So, for example, it controls what can go in and out. So cumin, coriander weren't allowed in. Certain grains were allowed in. Potato chips weren't allowed in. Any kind of dual-use material couldn't go in. But so many in the international community say that Gaza is still occupied by Israel. Israel claims that since 2005, Gaza has been outside of its occupation.
And what's your take?
Well,
the official take, at least in the book. I mean, you've written this book, so you and Julie are authorities. Do you believe that Gaza was autonomous or still?
So we try very hard to sort of lay out contending arguments and the facts and quotes and let readers make some decisions by themselves. I think there is definitely if you look at international law and the argument of what effective control may be, there's a very compelling argument that Israel maintains effective control over Gaza by controlling the borders, by controlling the airspace, by controlling the water space, by controlling what goes in and out. Since 2003, Israel has controlled Gaza, right there. I don't think many would question that.
Yeah, well, no,
forces are there on the ground.
Invaded. So
yeah.
There seems to be a narrative, Maia, that suggests, or I've heard the argument on this show and elsewhere, that Israeli policy prior to October 2023 almost forced Hamas's hand into this gruesome, I don't know what you would call it, invasion or pogrom or whatever else that happened on October the 7th, 2023. What's your argument in the book between the nature of the Israeli, I don't know, whatever word you would use, Israeli surrounding and squeezing of Gaza, and October 7th? Are they connected? Was the Palestinian hand forced, or is there a narrative here?
Yeah, I think one of the things we haven't talked about yet is the fact that there were many wars that Israel conducted, and many in Gaza from 2006, 2007, 2008, up until 2021. So during that time period, those who were living in Gaza experienced one war after another. So it wasn't really a quiet time in Gaza, and Gaza went into 2023 already in a very fragile state, because there was Operation Cast Lead 2008, 2009. There were Operation Pillar of Storm. There were Operation Protective Edge. There was the March of Great Return. There were all of these different wars that happened in Gaza that further destroyed Gaza, that further impoverished the society and made more destruction that couldn't be rebuilt, because of, again, the limitations on what could and could not come in terms of dual use materials. So I think Gaza was a site of ongoing war and ongoing conflict during this time, and was under this blockade during this time. One of the things that we note in the book was that Hamas was intentionally very quiet in the 2 years leading up to 2023. But there was also a concern with the signing of the Abraham Accords with other countries, with a shift in U.S. administrations to looking at other parts of the world, that Palestinians were being forgotten. A concern on the increasing settlement expansion in the West Bank, changes in some of the policies in Jerusalem, and Hamas leadership noted that there were these brief flickers of awareness and remembering about the Palestinian cause when these different wars went on. But I do really want to note that many of the Gazans that we interviewed talked about how horrific they saw the events of October 7th, and the response was not justified in terms of what then happened to Gaza. And we also had interviewees talk about how they felt like Hamas had betrayed them, in that Hamas was planning this, but didn't think at all about what the ramifications would be for the Palestinian population in Gaza. So yes, the events of October 7th were atrocious, and they were clearly well planned out in advance. There are many different motivations that have been attributed to Hamas for this, in terms of trying to carry out an operation before Israel had additional air defenses, in terms of raising attention to the Palestinian cause, concern for Saudi Arabia signing normalization agreements with Israel. So there are lots of reasons why people have pointed to why this happened, and the timing, why it happened. Of course, the anniversary of the Ramadan Yom Kippur War. But I do want to emphasize how many of those that we interviewed condemned that October 7th attack.
What was your own when you heard about October 7th? What was your, I mean, you're someone who's studies this in great detail. Was it shock, horror?
I mean, all of the above. I mean, shock and horror. You have over 1,000 civilians who are brutally murdered. You have many people who are from sort of kibbutzes, and at an international musical festival, a lot of those people are people who tend to be more left-leaning and supportive of sort of peace, and looking for a sustainable resolution to the Israel-Palestine issues. But it's over 1,000 innocent lives lost. Anytime there's that kind of life. One of the things that was emphasized by those we interviewed, again, was any life lost is a life lost, and it's a story that touches everyone who knows that person, right?
Yeah, and of course, especially in Gaza, where many people have lost their lives. In the 2 years that have occurred since, or a little more than 2 years now, since October 7th, Maia, would it be fair to say, I mean, the Western press are not allowed in, so no one quite knows what's happened. We've had appalling numbers. I don't know what they are, 60, 70,000 deaths of Palestinians.
We're now at around over 70,000.
Okay, so over 70,000. What happened in the last what has happened over the last 15 months in Gaza? Is the whole country essentially been flattened? And when I say country, I mean, we're talking,
Right.
wasn't formerly a country. Has Gaza essentially been, judging from the images which I found on the internet, it looks as if the whole place has just been sent back to the Stone Age.
Yeah, I mean, Gaza has been decimated, absolutely. And I do want to say that even though many foreign journalists have been kept out, there are many, many brave Palestinians who have continued to video and document and share stories online. And so there's a lot of documentation of what has been going on and what continues to go on the ground. I also was looking at footage that has been put out by the BBC and others that has aerial images of looking at what has happened even since October 10th and the ceasefire of 2025, and looking at ongoing destruction that's happening in Gaza, and in destruction of areas that were not previously damaged, destruction of agricultural land, destruction of homes. And so there is ongoing destruction that is happening even after the ceasefire. There has been destruction of over 90% of the schools in Gaza. So children are starting to go back to school now for the first time after 2 years in tents. And a lot of the universities have been destroyed. And so university students are trying to study online, also in tents with erratic electricity, erratic internet. But there's a lot of effort of Palestinians to carry on. Education has always been a priority for Palestinians. But there is massive destruction. Homes have been destroyed, buildings, apartment buildings have been destroyed. And again, this is on top of all of those wars that have happened since 2006 that I was mentioning.
So we need to end with the quote unquote peace. We began this talking about Trump's vision of a Trumpian Gaza, sort of a Mediterranean version, I guess, of Las Vegas, or an extension of the Gulf states, which may or may not be realistic. Doesn't strike me as being particularly realistic. Is there peace now in Gaza? There's a ceasefire, whatever that means. I mean, the Washington Post reports on a ceasefire, but they also know that war is still taking place. And the Wall Street Journal notes that while the war might be paused, the battle over aid rages on. What's the current situation? Is it one of peace or war, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, so I would say, in peace studies, we talk about positive peace, which is peace that has sort of rights, liberties, human rights, the ability to reach human potential. And we talk about negative peace, which is the absence of war. I would say we have none of those in Gaza right now. Definitely not a positive peace, but we don't really even have a negative peace. I just mentioned sort of the ongoing destruction that's shown by sort of these satellite images. But we also, since the ceasefire went into effect October 10th, 2025, we have over 400 Palestinians who've been killed by Israelis. We have over 1,000 Palestinians who've been injured by Israelis fire. And we have, again, ongoing hunger. Right now it's winter, it's raining, people are living in tents. So there's going to be deaths from starvation, injuries, etc. So we don't even have really a negative peace either. Additionally, there's an ongoing challenges to get humanitarian aid in. Just recently, there have been about 37 organizations, humanitarian organizations, including Doctors Without Borders, who are having their sort of access restricted by Israel because of these new operation orders that Israel is putting in place that makes it very difficult for them to get registration and permits to deliver
so
aid.
You talk about there not being a negative peace. What language should we use? And it may not be war. Is it an unpeace? What words would you use to describe the current situation?
I mean, we have ongoing violence. I would say that the word ceasefire is problematic because neither party. I mean, I can say I know less about all of the factors that are going on in the ground, but from a very clear perspective, the terms of the ceasefire are not being held. If you have 400 Palestinians who've been killed and over 1,000 Palestinians who've been injured, and you don't have the amount of aid getting in that is supposed to get in. So there's ongoing violence that is happening. And so there is not, the ceasefire is not being implemented to the extent of the terms that were outlined.
Yeah, I don't think that's great news. I don't think anyone would disagree, maybe even in Israel. The subtitle of your book is The Dream and the Nightmare. Clearly, the nightmare is the reality of what's happening now in Gaza. let's end, Maya, with some very realistic, small next steps. What could happen in the next 6 months to a year to make this at least less of a nightmare? We can't realistically talk about peace or any of those sorts of things, but what do you recommend in the book, or what do you think as an activist, as a scholar in this area, you and Julie, what do you recommend that's realistic, that isn't going back to some sort of fantasy that's not going to happen?
Right. Well, I think it's important to. So I'm based in the US. I think it's important for the US and US taxpayers to look at how their tax dollars are being used, and to push for the use of tax dollars to enforce the ceasefire, to hold all parties accountable to the terms of a ceasefire that was laid out, and to call for Palestinian agency. The current plan outlined by President Trump does not really allow for Palestinian agency and for Palestinian self-determination. And I think ultimately it is important for us to think about, if you're going to have a future of Gaza that is sort of sustainable and that can live in peaceable existence with its neighbors, that there needs to be a Palestinian voice into what that future looks like, and encouraging efforts that raise up that Palestinian voice and allow space for Palestinian actors to have a say in their future, I think is a very important point for people in the international community to support and lift up and encourage our representatives to advocate for.
Well, it's a very, very depressing situation. There's a new book, Gaza, The Dream and the Nightmare, by Julie Norman and my guest, Maia Carter Hallward. Congratulations, Maia, on the new book and for bringing this incredibly controversial subject to a broader audience. And I hope that things will improve there rather than get worse. Sometimes one wonders how much worse they can get. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.